So why don't we get started? We have about a half an hour and I feel I have lots to say. So then could we have number one? This is a map of 1830, part of a wider map. And I cut it, we took a inset of this neighborhood. And you'll notice King Street, a few houses, and there are three streets running east and west. Look to the left and see the almshouse, and then down the three streets. The top one was Spring Street, which is now Finn Street. The next one, Summer Street. And the next one, I don't know the name from 1830, but it's now known as Trumbull Road. There was a school on King Street since 1810. And we can see the King Street brook running through. And the interesting thing about this is the canal is shown, which was called the Hampden and Hampshire Canal. The map is 1831, but the map didn't come to the canal didn't come to Northampton until 1834. And it was a jubilant day. And I didn't have time to find a map from the canal locally, but this is a canal boat I found on a Connecticut history website. And I get a kick out of this because it's actually a smaller version of what the canal boats that came through what is now King Street. And I always had trouble visualizing that canal boats floating down State Street. But notice the three horses and the man with the whip riding them on. And there's always an idealized view of the canal, the women and the men with their parasols and their top hats. I laugh at this because when I was researching my Market Street book, I came across a Theodore Bliss, who was 13 years old when he took the canal line to New Haven. And there was a two-man crew, a boy to drive the two horses, and young Bliss took 7 days
they used to go down
to
King
reach
Street,
New Haven.
State Street.
Oh, just the
Can you hear it?
The canal, yeah.
Okay.
Let me get my.
And he spent most of his time walking with the boy or riding on one of the horses. Needless to say, he took the stage coach home, which was a much more better ride than 7 days. The canal went bankrupt in 1847. Ice, drought, vandalism, animals chewing the locks. It was a boondoggle from the start, 88 miles long, and it cost the investors $1,000. So you could see how the canal would deter the development of the neighborhood running all the way up to the river. So the idea that there would be a seaport to the Atlantic from the Northampton was a completely a failed venture. So can we go to number 3, Ben? Now, I'm happy this turned out so well. I photographed it from the computer. This is Form B. The building is at 218 State Street. And in 1976, the Massachusetts Historical Association conducted a survey of buildings throughout the Commonwealth. And they came to Northampton, and there are hundreds upon hundreds of buildings. And each building gave the architectural characteristics of the building, as well as the historical significance. When they came to State Street, they did the buildings on both corners of Finn but they stopped. And which was sad because these Form Bs, which are available on Historic Northampton's website, are filled with information about the houses. One quote really struck me when I was reading the Form B was, "This large house," and you could see a double version of it here, I think. This large house is the only structure along the street that was probably standing while the canal was in operation. From visual evidence, it appears that the house dates to the late 18th century, but at that time, there were no streets between Prospect and King Street. Now, the inventory on the back, along with the architectural and historical information, will give every deed that they use to research the house with the page and the number. So that means if you were researching, interested in your house and it was on this, you could go to the Registry of Deeds and find out the history of your house through the deeds, which are just packed with information. The first deed shows that in 1786, the first seller of the house was Solomon Allen, who was a descendant of the original families. And that happens to be the same year as the Hampshire Gazette was founded. And in its very second issue, Allen had the very first ad to appear in the paper. He had a large quantity of coarse salt, and he wanted to sell or exchange it to flaxseed, showing that he was probably a farmer. And he actually had a little store, or a stand as they called it, across from the meeting house. It was very unusual to see any kind of retail operation on Main Street at that time. His sale was for 4 acres, and they were still using pounds. It was 120 pounds. And the population was approaching about 1,600. So we could see, please, 4. Now, this is the house today, and you can see its fenestration, the windows, the 5 on the top, the 4, the central chimney are still, it was startling how much has changed, but obviously there are parts that were later additions to it. In the beginning, it was mostly farmers who sold the house often to their sons, and not handed down, but sold as they did in those days. And that was until 1833, when a Dr. Benjamin Barrett arrived, a Harvard graduate from a native of Concord, Mass., a prominent physician in town and civic leader who went on to be a state senator and representative. He bought the house and most of the original 4 acres for $350. So there wasn't much advance in price. The 1830s were called the hard times for New England due to bank failures and drop in property values and rising prices. So that had a huge impact on the agricultural economy. And interestingly, his deed states that part of the tract had been taken for the Hampshire and Hamden Canal. So that really places this house on the canal. And another interesting thing was on the east, which is now State Street. That was called Hawley Lane after Major Joseph Hawley, who was a distinguished military veteran and lawyer who had given 1,000 acres of his legacy to start a grammar school in Northampton around 1800. Now, Barrett, he may have rented the house or lived in it for a while, but he had grander plans. And if we could have number 5. This is the manse. You probably know this on Upper Prospect Street near Smith. And this was the home of it, the Reverend Solomon Stoddard, who was the second minister in Northampton and happened to be the grandfather of um, Jonathan Edwards. Uh, he he served a long tenure in the pulpit of First Church from 1672 to 1729. And the house deed, according to the Form Bs of the inventory, the house dates to 1684. And the survey presented that the present 18th century gambrel roof, which was very trendy at the time, structure was built over the original 17th century foundation. The next, one of the next owners was another out-of-towner who came from Worcester. So again, all the early owners had been born in Northampton. Many descended from the early families. And the economy was changing in Northampton. More and more newcomers were coming in. He came from Worcester and he was known as Colonel Spalding, and during the 1870s, he was a co-owner of the famed Round Hill Hotel. He bought the house in 1856 for $1,425, so Dr. Barrett made a little on the sale. And unlike Dr. Barrett, he evidently was content with his house. He lived there until 1887, probably the longest owner, according to the earlier deeds. His deed mentions that the town had just laid out a new road, and that would be State Street after the canal ditch was covered over. Okay, can we go now? We'll just go to talk about the Catholic Church on King Street. Ben, okay. This article in the Gazette caught my eye when I was doing on the Catholic Church on King Street. That was there for many years. This is from the Gazette, October 30th, 1866. The Catholic Society are to build a tasty parsonage near their church on King Street for $4,000. And Mr. Pratt, that would be William Fenno Pratt, Northampton's favorite architect, had laid out the plans. 25 years earlier, the Catholic Society had bought their lot on King Street for $385, which would be at the foot of present-day Church Street, and they also had a parsonage. At the time, there were about 150 Catholics, and they would come to their wooden church, which was 40 feet and 3 pews, and it would be the first Catholic church in Hampshire County, would be on King Street. And people would come from absolutely miles around on foot because there was no other kinds of transportation at the time. And the first mass was on Christmas Day in 1845. So it was a huge step forward for the Catholic community. They called their church the St. Mary's of Assumption. And as the Catholic population grew, it was twice expanded. In the arrival of the Irish immigrants, single men and women initially, working on the railroad or as domestics, And then when the population famine of 1848 and 50 came, accelerated their immigration and brought a range of ages. More and more Irish and Catholics arrived. So the church was twice enlarged, and its cemetery, which was once at Agnes Fox, was consecrated in 1865. By 1850, the population of Northampton was about nearing 5,300. And before the decade was over, 1 out of 4 residents would be an immigrant, and the majority of whom were Irish, followed by the Germans, a number of whom were also of the Catholic faith. Across King Street was a small Irish settlement in Millyard, and they were mostly people with young children of school age or younger, and the parents were born in Ireland and the children born in the United States. By 1885, the Catholic community was worshiping in its magnificent church at the foot of Elm Street. But the town's growing French Canadian community, which lived around Market Street, they were seeking their own place of worship. So they petitioned the Catholic bishop in Springfield, that they wanted to rent the old church for $120 a year. And they did that until their own church on King Street was built in the early 20th century. It seems that the initial Catholic church was torn down around 1903, but its name lives on in Church Street. And unfortunately, the William Fenner Wright's parsonage appears not to exist. Could we have the 1873 map then, please? Thanks. Oh, good. It looks good. Thank you. Now we go up to 1873. Since the last map we saw at 31, Northampton's population has grown by 181%. The railroad, of course, would have a significant factor in that. We had see the railroads running on the right. There was the Connecticut River Railroad that came in 1843. And the New Haven and Northampton followed around 1855. And finally, the Boston, Mass Central, or Boston and Maine, as it was later known, in 1887. And if you notice on the right, it says Mass, you can just see Mass, it's Mass Central. That railroad line, which doesn't exist in 1870, stops at Edwards Square, which would be facing what Dunkin' Donuts is now. And the talk was that the railroad would have their own depot there, but never happened. So when I first moved to Summer Street, there was always talk that the group of houses that had been built on Summer and Myrtle were built for the railroad workers. And of course, it all fizzed out that the Boston Central would come to Edwards Square, or now known as North Street, that they would go downtown and get a new depot. By 1847, the canal was bankrupt. Droughts, ice, vandalism had caused its failure. And the New Haven and Northampton Railroad bought the right of way and they called it the Canal Railroad. So you often hear that in historical accounts of Northampton, called the Canal Line. The arrival of the railroads, pushed the town into industrial economy in Leeds, Bay State, Florence, and they were producing silk thread and cotton and wool cloths, buttons, paper, sewing machines. But the neighborhood west of Spring Street was power, except their human power, and the residents worked, many of them worked in the factories. And later on, the neighborhood would supply the acreage around 1900 for the huge railroad yards that were built on both sides of King, Potpourri, and the Stop and Shop area. That was a huge facility, and there were upwards of 900 men in Northampton working in the yards and elsewhere on the railroads. But we see in the 1870 map, there is more development. The cemetery has their good sized plot up to State Street. And there is, some development, but still west of Spring Street toward downtown is still much more developed. We have number 7, please. Okay, this house is 11 Stoddard Street, and Stoddard Street was opened up in 1867 by William H. Stoddard, who filed a subdivision plan, and he called his new street, modest man that he was, Chestnut Street. The first lot was sold to Michael Martin, who worked in a brickyard, and he and his wife, Kate, were Irish born according to the 1870 US Census, and they had 5 children ages 1 to 6, all born in Massachusetts, the typical pattern of the parents born in Ireland and the children in the United States. Michael probably built his house himself, as men in construction, carpentry, masonry did at that time. And the Form B inventory notes the quality of this construction when you think this house is, about 150 odd years, that tradespeople, members of the emerging middle class, as Michael Martin would be, and his wife, that the quality of the craftsmanship built for their family homes was really just tremendous. And you can see it throughout Northampton today. Now, who was William Stoddard? William Stoddard was a prominent dry goods merchant and who owned a shop on Main Street. And he was an original member of Edwards Church. And by 1870, his real estate portfolio was worth $20,000. And he had considerably amount of land around Stoddard. And I don't know the history of Winter, but I wouldn't be surprised if he had developed that. But one of the things in doing research, you find these side stories that are interesting. So bear with me. By the time he filed the subdivision plan, he had been twice a widower, and he soon married his sister-in-law, Sophia Dana Hazen Stoddard, a graduate of Mount Holyoke Seminary in 1841, where she was a teacher and associate principal. Her husband that she married was Reverend David Stoddard, a widower, and he was a missionary in Persia for many years. And Sophia joined him and his young daughter there and returned to the US upon her husband's death and married her brother-in-law, Mr. Stoddard. Could we go back to the 1873 one? Thanks. You see some large undeveloped parcels still held by private owners, such as James Cudahy, whose property would develop into Prospect Court. And I couldn't find much about him, except during the 1880s, he lived at the foot of Perkins on State Street and was a laborer. Edwin Warfield, according to this Gazette, he bought Reverend John Alden's place for $6,000, which was a handsome sum in those days, on the corner of Spring and Prospect in 1867. A year earlier, he had married Mary Aldrich, a familiar name in the neighborhood, whose father owned a pelt and wool business and who had patented a wool duster. Warfield and a partner purchased sole right to manufacture the duster from his father-in-law, and the partners opened a business in a building on King and Spring Street, now Finn, where the tanning, dyeing, and manufacture would be conducted to fill. They already had 2,000 to 3,000 orders awaiting the dusters, which I found remarkable for a new business. He opened Warfield Place in 1885, and I think this note may ring some red in the neighborhood. According to the Gazette, the city spent $189 to lay the street's new sidewalk. We go into number 9. Well, fittingly, we'll go to 22 Aldrich Street in 1892. That was a latecomer as far as this streets opening in the neighborhood. In 1892, Avon Matthews, who was a builder, and I ran into him many times in the Market Street book. He had a lot of buildings on the Market Street, including the apartment right at the foot of Graves. He filed a plan to open Aldrich Street, and James Powers, mason builder for the leading firm Brown and Bailey in Northampton, he and his wife purchased a lot, and they built this what Form B of the inventories called, kind of a subdued Queen Anne style house. He also built a house at 26 Aldrich, if you're familiar with that neighborhood. The Powers sold the house in 1910 to Oliver and Emma Venas, who had 6 children, all of whom, except the youngest, worked in the hosiery mills. For the Mass Historic Commission, 22 Aldrich represents one more model of the quality of construction and enduring value achieved by their owner builders, which is seen today throughout the city. And there's so many houses like this still standing, over 120 years or so, that have maintained their integrity. What time is it? I guess we must be running out of time. Do we have any more time? We want to ask some questions. And
the meeting goes beyond 8 if you want to keep going, and we can have questions, whatever you
okay.
want to do.
We could do number 10 and 11. Finish up with that. Well, I could just speak briefly of, here is this was on the corner of Myrtle and is part of the cottage development, kind of the mini Levittown of 1872 that was part of featured in my 17th Summer Street book. And it's an example of the vernacular architecture of that period as opposed to what you just saw with the Aldridge stylish Queen Anne, much more imposing house. This house is basically only a floor and a half, story and a half. So we could go to the last one is quick. This is the building that I think may have come with the original one. The Form B said that there was a market in 1883. And that was where Brown's Market, if many of you who've been in the neighborhood a while will remember Brown's Market and the butcher. They had fresh meats and stuff. And then the next one is from the early 20th century, about 1910. That was built as a State Street store, a grocery store, and preceded by another store just up the street near Summer Street, small frame building that's been made into an apartment. This one, you may recall, was a uniform shop.
Mhm.
And an antique collectible shop before it became 2 condos. I moved to Summer Street in 83, and my family reminded me that they had bought uniforms there for my daughter's high school job as a waitress at Rockridge. But I don't know what was there before. I don't imagine the grocery store had been gone out of business. So that would be a short walk through the neighborhood, and I'm glad to be back in Ward 1A, however briefly, my home for almost 30 years. But
Oh, that is wonderful. So interesting. If people have questions, they can either unmute themselves or they can raise their hand and I can call on them.
especially if they have stories about their house or wondering about their house.
So it looks like John Galvin, you have a question?
I do. Thanks, Ann. And thanks, Lou. That was great. Really
Oh,
interesting.
glad you enjoyed it.
So what, if I understood the map right, there was a church off of in what is now Agnes Fox Park, if I followed what you were saying, and then a cemetery. And I remember reading somewhere, I can't remember where, that after the big hurricane roughly 100 years ago, that became the park. But anyway, so what was the church? Just wanted to make sure I heard you right. There was also a church there, and then that became, or the cemetery outlived the church, and then eventually, how do you turn a cemetery into a park?
The church was dedicated as the St. John's Church, but somehow I think the people in the parish called it St. Mary's of Assumption, which it is now. And that was built around 1841. And that was really a bold move for the Catholic community. They had been meeting in somebody's house up in Leeds. There were a lot of factory workers who were immigrants living up there. They called it Factory Village. And you think from 1840 to the 1880s, just a little bit over 40 years, they went from that little church up to like cathedral-like place up on Elm Street, and spent a decade before they actually had the dedication up there of raising money. They had bought the plot with an big old hotel they had to raise. And then imagine that the bodies in the cemetery were moved when St. Mary's Cemetery up on Bridge Road was opened. They would have exhumed them.
Of course, we all wonder if there's bodies still remaining.
Yeah, I know, I was gonna say, we'd rather not think of that, right?
I have a question. I'm Claire. I live on Perkins.
Good.
Related to
For
that,
history of your street.
pardon, you have stories?
I wish I had trouble finding any history of your street.
Yeah, okay. Well, the one thing I heard when I moved here 5 years ago was the cemetery, when that flood happened,
Yeah.
that evidently there were some graves that were very shallow, and some of the bodies actually came out of the ground and floated.
Oh, yeah, I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, I wish I knew more about that, but that's, I just heard that by someone who lived here, knew someone who actually years before, told him about it and had seen it.
I don't know when that exact decade that flood was, and I imagine the Gazette would have
Mhm.
the
So it was related to that hurricane someone mentioned.
yeah. Historic Northampton has the Gazettes that during the night, Ben probably knows more of this, but during the 1930s, it was a WPA project for the writers, and they went through the old Gazettes and they compiled a list of 2 personal names, names, and then things like churches and elections and historic business. And that's available at Historic Northampton. I've used it all the time. And you can find out hurricanes, look up hurricanes, and that would give you some time. And then you can go over to Forbes and check it out on the microfiche, right?
Good idea.
That will help you.
I'll chime in there. The WPA index is fantastic. It goes up through, I want to say 1920, but around there for sure. There's also a full text index to the Gazette from the mid-90s on, and there are indexes to the Gazette at the Forbes Library for most of the time in between. Those ones are not online.
Yeah.
There is one decade for which we have no index, which is very frustrating. But if anyone is interested in doing research about local history, we have indexes to most of the Gazette at Forbes Library, and we can connect you with the stuff that is online and do research on your behalf for things that aren't and so forth. You can come into the library and use the physical indexes there. Many of the ones that are not online are actually card catalog cards.
Yeah.
But there are lots of resources available for that.
No. I also use something online. There is a fee for it, and I think it's put out by the Mormons in Salt Lake, the Genealogy Bank, which has been enormously helpful for me doing, of course, when I wrote 17 Summer Street, I don't think there was any internet so long ago, barely any internet. But then when I did the Market Street, North Street, and that, so much more available. And that has been a tremendous help.
I have a comment. I've always been interested in, we live on Prospect Court.
Yeah.
And our house, I was told, is one of those Sears houses.
Oh,
I see our house all over town, the same center chimney, square house. And I think that's really fascinating, just to the same houses all around and the variations of them.
I see it in other places.
you know, that, I sometimes see the things with some of them, I think Sears were bungalows, weren't they? I mean, more from the 20s.
Yeah,
Your
yeah.
yours would be an earlier, I assume, being on Prospect Court. But that would be a fascinating, there must be, somebody must have written a book on that. You can
I
Google
wonder.
it, you know,
Yeah.
I'm sure this Mark?
Mark, did you have something you wanted to ask? You need to unmute.
Yeah, actually, just a quick story about our house. I'm Mark, this is Denise. We live on Prospect Street. Our house, we assume, was built in about 1840, 1841. About 3 years ago, we did a renovation to make it easier to age in place. And we tore down an old back section of the house. When we took the siding off, we saw on the old wood planks, there were these drawings of ships.
Hmm.
I'll show you one of them if it'll,
Oh.
Oh, wow.
and we brought in someone from the Historical Society who told us that a lot of the people who did the carpentry and built the houses were also shipbuilders.
Hmm.
I don't understand whether there was a seasonal migration or what, but you know, we saved those planks from the side of the house. We haven't figured out what to do with them. Anyway, I thought just let people know that.
That, and what was it, 1840, 1820?
1840, 1841, I think.
I have to check that out. I know when we were working on our Summer Street house, which was 1872, and modestly, as we didn't have sash cords and all that would stick, as my son, who was doing a lot of the renovations, said they wanted to save a nickel and they didn't put in the decent thing. But we saw signatures of obviously the men who had worked on it and with the date, and then old letters and inkwells and in the boards, and also pallets were used that came off the railroad. So they would have come right across the street, and then they, you know, for the walls, you know. But they
Well, I have a question.
fascinating story.
I have a question, Lou. Thank you very much for your research and all. This is George. Many of us here on this Zoom meeting live in old houses. And I think many of us are, like myself, are intrigued exactly how old they are. I know I've tried to do some research through the deeds and the county register, but I understand that there was a big fire in Northampton that may have destroyed a lot of records, census records and house deeds. Because I think what's really valuable sometimes driving around old towns like ours is to see on the house that little block that says circa 1840 or, you know, 1902.
Yeah.
And it gives a visitor a sense of, you know, the history. So can you tell me, or maybe Ben knows about that fire and what has happened to some of those records?
I had never heard that.
Ah,
Ben, have you heard that?
I've heard the same story. I think Elise Feely told it to me, although I'm not sure. I don't know any details, but there are a large number of records missing. And as a result, a lot of properties kind of get these cookie cutter dates. You'll find far more houses built in 1900 in Northampton than could have possibly be built in 1900. They just like said,
Yeah.
it was sometime around then, we'll just call it 1900.
That's right. That was an assessing, you know. I have a story about what George was talking about, putting the plaque on your house. When I was doing my North to Market book, and I lived on North Street opposite the cemetery, and there was a lovely old white frame house. across the street, and I discovered that, I forget the dates off my top of the head, but it was a farmer, farmland, and then the farmer sold it for two lots to be built. And the man who bought it, I think, was a painter. And his name was Richardson. And that house was, I think, 1870. And so I'm driving to Trader Joe's one day on North on my way, and I see a sign on the thing, and it said Richardson. It had a new owner, Richardson House. I laughed so hard. I had to go and park and go and see it, and it had a date. The only thing is, he was 10 years off. He made the house older than it was, than the deed showed, and I didn't dare. So the house, he's now renting an apartment in the house. And I noticed the ad says it's called the Richardson House. So it's suddenly probably gone up in value. But I'm thinking, did he read the book, or where did he get that from?
I have another quick question. Lou and Michael Kirby mentioned that they moved to Summer Street about 88 or so, or 81 maybe. So they've been in this neighborhood for 40 years. Is there anybody else here in this meeting who's been here that long or longer, say 50 years? Mark?
Yeah, we've been here 44 years, I think, in this house.
Oh, in the house. Well, I moved to Northampton, it's 1976, and this is where my interest in local history started. My family and I rented the Calvin Coolidge house on Massasoit Street. And that was a fun time. And Mike was along. He also lived there. And then when we married, we moved to 73 to Northampton on Summer Street. But I met John Coolidge, his son, at the Mount Holyoke reunion. And I knew his wife was celebrating her 50th anniversary or something. So I introduced myself as being the occupant. And I don't know why, I had this desire to find out where everybody slept. And he was so charming, and as his wife was, he was married to a Trumbull governor's, descendant of Connecticut. And he said that like so many of us who have sold a house or moved, that every time he came to a Clark School trustee meeting, he drove by the house to check it out. And he didn't like the color. It was kind of a sandy brown color. So he was but I was so thrilled to find out where everybody slept.
I see that Leah Kunkel has unmuted. Leah, do you have a question?
Well, I moved here 40 years ago, and I'm in my same house, and I keep meaning to look up the history of it. It's on that stretch of Prospect between Summer, almost at the corner of Summer and Prospect. I haven't exactly dated the house, but a friend of mine who was in my basement once, and he's no longer around on this dimension, but he said that he definitely felt my house was 18th century just from what he looked in the basement. It's an old salt box. And I had a couple of questions. I had heard that there used to be a spring that ran down Prospect Street. Do you know if that's true? And also how old, just like say between Summer and Spring, or Finn and Summer Street, like were there some really, were there 18th century houses there? I think mine's been through so many changes, but it looks like it could be that old.
Yeah,
So,
what number are is your house?
It's now 101.
101. Let me see if that's on the inventory.
While you're looking, I'll say that one thing I do know is that around 100 years ago, it
Yeah.
was occupied by Professor Welch, who was a professor of music at Smith.
Hmm, hmm.
And he had 6 children, and he is the reason why my house is almost 5,000 square feet of living space. He added on bedrooms for the 6 children. And he also built a music room because he was a musician, where I understand he had 2, not 1, but 2 concert grand pianos. And he even had a dehumidifier installed in the room that, you know, could take the water. So this is 100 years ago. So he doubled the size of the house. And he did sort of in an arts and crafts style edition. And then, and amazingly, one of his children, who was in her 90s, I guess, stopped by my house about 30 years ago and came in and saw part of it. She was visiting from out of town, but she was here and gone. You know, I never got to ask her many questions, but so I do know who was here 100 years ago, but I once said to someone that, you know, everyone who comes to this house seems to stay for several decades. You know, and I said, you know, it must be like me, like they just fall in love with a house.
Yeah.
And one of my smart aleck friends said, yeah, they just can't get rid of it. So I'm here wandering my 19 rooms, you know, but it seems like the right size.
I'll check to see whether you were on the inventory, the Mass Commission. That
Okay.
to me, it would. I sometimes I wonder how they decided what to do and not to do. Obviously, they did all the Smith College buildings and things that are obviously architecturally worthy, and you know somebody lives there.
Right.
But I also like the fact that they did, like my house, my modest house on Summer Street was in the inventory, and others like it. But it seemed to me, even walking on State Street, there are some houses there that are quite old.
Mm-hmm.
Should have been on the inventory. Well, it sounds like a great place.
Like Denise, you have a comment?
Yeah, I have a question for Lou. When we live on Prospect between Summer and Finn, and it's a very old house, it's by 1840. And when we bought the house, we were interested to find that the interior ceiling for our living room is canvas. It's a canvas ceiling, and you can tell that it's not sheetrock or something. In the summertime, when it's damp out, it will have a bow to it. And in the winter, because of the heating, it's very tight, you know. And we were told by the owners that the only other house that still had a canvas ceiling was Calvin Coolidge's house. Do you happen to know if that's true, or no, it's not?
Not on Massasoit Street, but he did. He lived on Massasoit. Even when after he was president, and then the traffic became too much. Then he moved to the beaches.
Oh, it's probably in the beaches.
Off South Streets, maybe. And that was a fairly new house. I don't think. I really don't know the whole history, but
Maybe Michael does.
well, but that's fascinating about and that was,
Still works.
I think that string of houses from Summer to Finn is one of my favorite streets of group of houses. I could live in any of them. I love them. Set in the the ground, and they go bound in the gardens, but it's very interesting architecture. I have to look up that whole street in Prospect.
Michael, just go ahead.
You need to unmute your microphone, Michael.
Let me see who's here. I'm gonna see who's,
Is Michael trying to talk?
oh,
Or you need to unmute your,
unmute. He has problem hearing.
I wonder if I can unmute him.
He's upstairs. We have a 2-level.
Hmm. I can't unmute him. Oh, here he's coming down.
He's up. We have a odd apartment. Oh, I'm glad to see my Helen Weiss is on.
I wanted to, I'm Louisa. I live on,
Yeah, I did. Well, okay.
oh,
You
sorry, go ahead.
sit down.
Michael, you had something to say?
I do. I have a kind of a unique vantage point on history. I noticed there were 2 pictures of the large house that was in the corner of Finn and Prospect. And this was one of probably the only house that was there when the canal was in operation.
Yeah, 218. Yeah,
202.
yeah.
And my desk was against the door, not against the door, against the wall, looking out on Prospect Street when I worked for HCAC. And of course, the years of the building coming when it was a social service agency didn't do a great deal for its historical value. But I realize now, gee, looking out that window, I would have been able to look out onto the canal go by slowly. Evidently, it's very slow. I think, how long
Yes.
did it take, Lou, to get to?
7 days to get to New Haven. Yes.
All right, thank you very
Thank you
much.
for- You needed to unmute your thing.
Yeah.
Okay, Louisa, did you have something you wanted to add?
Thanks for calling on me when I just took a bite of something, Anne. Just mentioning, I live on 31 Perkins Avenue, and Trudy Hooks used to live here years ago, and she and I are actually having tea in a week or two so that she can tell me the history of the house and the order in which things were built. But I remember her suggesting to me a long time ago that it used to be a fishing shack. And I will just say that one of the mysteries of the house is that in the basement, which has a very narrow stairway right over here down to it, is a washer and dryer that are Maytags, at least 30 years old, probably more. They work perfectly. But when it comes time to replace them, there is nothing that can get down those stairs. And so nobody, had all kinds of professionals come in, can figure out how those things got down there. That seems like one of the earliest parts of the house. So the only guess is that it's so small that they may have lowered it. There's like an odd square cut into these old floors. Maybe it was lowered into there, or maybe they took it apart and set them down there. But it's hard to believe they were brand new at the time that they went in. So anyway, it's interesting, and I'm hoping that Trudy will shed some light on the history of this place. It's really something. It's this 1,000 square feet. It's such a great house. And there are just some oddities that I really wonder about so much every day.
What is the number of your house?
31.
Of what street?
Oh, Perkins Avenue.
Okay. Yeah, I was so disappointed that I couldn't find more about Perkins and when that apartment block went up. I imagine
Yeah.
1890s, looking at it 1900.
Yeah, I'm so curious about that too, but I'm going to ask Trudy if I can record our conversation, and if that's the case, I'm happy to share it with you if you want, Lou. Yeah, we'll see.
Great, well, thank you.
Well, is there anybody else? We probably should wind down. Well, thank you, Lou. This has been so much
I had a
fun.
lot of fun, and I really enjoyed it. It's been a year since I've done my last one, so I was very getting back into reading old gazettes, and thank you, Ben. I mean, I find it hard to talk and do screen sharing the screen. So that was great.
Yes, thank you, Ben, for saving the night.
And the neighborhood is ripe for anybody who wants to start writing a book about it, you know.
You know, and there are people that live in this neighborhood that have been here for a long time that may also have some good stories.
Yes, yeah.
I'd love to hear from them too.
Well, maybe we should do a part 2 sometime.
Right.
People bring their stories. But I really urge people to try to talk to Ben and snoop around historic Northampton as well. And
This might be a good time just to mention that we are having a potluck picnic on Sunday, July 10th at 5:30.
yeah,
So please come on down. We can, the 11th, thank you. Sunday, the 11th. Please come down. We can continue sharing these stories at Agnes Fox Playground down in the corner. Now I'm gonna invite your neighbors, and if you know some of those folks who you say have been around the neighborhood for quite some time, please tell them to come by. We'll have a couple of grills. So if you want to grill something, bring it, but mostly it'll be cold dishes to share.
Bring something. Yeah.
It's a potluck.
Yes.
Oh. Well, that'll be fun. I'll see you there.
And I see in the chat, Ben had put some information about if you want to do some research on your house, you can check out the chat. And you can save your chat also if you click on those 3 dots at the bottom of the chat screen, it will save it. And I'm not quite sure where it saves it to. I think it saves it into your documents folder.
Yeah, that I'm reading the chat and it's really, it will be saved.
It'll be saved, I believe, into your documents folder.
There's a lot of details there, but there's also the very short version I'll give right now, which is contact the library or contact Historic Northampton. You can't go wrong either way. We'll get you in touch with the right people. We'll make sure you get a good start on your research.
All right. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you for inviting
Thanks, Jan.
And if anybody has more ideas for topics that we can talk about next time, let me know, okay? All right, good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
That was great. Thanks, Ann. Thanks, Lou.